There's if you can maybe change tack slightly, and that's to now talk about something that you've previously worked on, but it's just been published as a book. And I just love the title of this book, and you're going to have to explain it first. It's the Iliad in a nutshell.
The Iliad in a nutshell. We'll give you the title in a nutshell.
Yes.
So this is a phrase that's familiar to us in English, isn't it?
Yeah.
In a nutshell. But the origin of it is actually a Latin text, so it's in Pliny's Natural History in the 7th book. And Pliny tells us about an unnamed artist who, crazy, we think of its crazy feat, was to take the Iliad, so the biggest, the most mighty, the most fundamental work of all Greek literature, the fundamental epic actually, and quite literally cut it down to size. And what he did, we're told, according to Pliny, is get a piece of parchment, write the entire text down, and then fold it up and put it in the shell, the nut.
The whole of it.
The whole of it, yeah, exactly. But what for me was even more interesting about this anecdote was the fact that you have other artists in antiquity apparently going one further, so going one further than this nameless artist mentioned in Pliny. And we have, according to Aelian and several other sources as well, we have reference to two guys called Mermesides and Callicrates. And they go one further as much as they write the entire epic not on parchment and a nut, but on a sesame seed. So they take the biggest work and they write it in a nutshell, but one that's even smaller. And in fact, we have another story that says that they're working not just with the Iliad, not just reproducing the Iliad, but both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So taking the two most fundamental epics.
How far can you take this?
How far can you go? Yeah, absolutely.
So how is this for you a way in? What's your book about?
So this was a way of framing the interpretive states for a particular set of objects. And the objects are called, again, a bit of a mouthful, the Tabulae Iliacae, or in English, the Iliac tablets.
Okay.
And they're a set of 22 marble reliefs, all of them miniature in size, very small, and all of them combining inscriptions with images. So they're reliefs, but they're inscribed with words, but also inscribed with pictures.
And they suggest that they have something to do with the Iliad.
Absolutely right. So the title refers back, the title is not ancient, it's first coined about 4 centuries ago.
Okay.
And it refers to the Iliad, so Iliad. And in fact, the tablets take the Iliad, but they also take all manner of other subjects. So 13 engage with the Iliad specifically, but we also have tablets that engage with other poems from the so-called epic cycle. So the little Iliad, so the Iliad could get even smaller. But you also have the Odyssey, you have scenes from the life of Heracles, and you have historical chronicles, also all reduced to this inscribed miniature form.
And how have they been interpreted in the past?
Interesting, yeah. So if you go to the 19th century, you find people showing quite a lot of love to these objects, appreciating them and writing about them at quite some length, and actually putting them onto the agenda of art at this particular period. And perhaps we should say what the period is between the late 1st century BC and early 1st century AD. All of these objects seem to come from the region of Rome, in a loose sense.
And it's the early imperial period.
Absolutely right, yeah, so under Augustus or under the Julio-Claudians.
Okay.
All of them come from near Rome, all of them are inscribed on grand, posh materials, so on Palombino or Giallo Antico, so grand, colourful, expensive marbles.
Okay, so far so good.
Yeah, exactly. So this is just to give you a bit of context. What were we going to talk about? I've forgotten what we were...
well, the reception.
Yeah, so
19th century, people are respected. I sense a buck coming.
Yeah, so 19th century people were very appreciative of this material. The 20th century saw standards or estimations dropping considerably, I'd say. Most people saw these things as, in the English-speaking world at least, saw these things as objects for the Nouveau Riche of Rome, objects for people like Trimalchio from Petronius and Satyricon, Friedman, has scenes of the Iliad and the Odyssey on his walls, has Homeric cups, but knows nothing about Homer.
More money than taste.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So, one way of thinking about this thing, these objects were as lowbrow objects for nouveau riche, objects that don't have any kind of cultural meaning or significance.
So why did people take that scholarly strategy? I mean, you can see that they've thought about, they've tried to place it in a cultural context. Yeah. A good source there would be Petronius, real life, satirising this nouveau rich guy. But why take that scholarly strategy? What is it about these tablets that would encourage people to take this kind of...
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one thing that's crucial here is, in terms of a particular strand of scholarship, namely that of a guy called Kurt Weitzmann, responding to an earlier tradition that goes all the way back to Villanowitz here in Germany in the late 19th century, but which sees these things as passive illustrations, as reflections of a lost tradition of book illustration that stretches back to the Hellenistic world. So, because these things were seen not to have much significance in their own right, but only to have a kind of passive significance for saying something about a lost tradition of book illustration, I think in some ways it was perhaps only a short step to think about these things as being kind of nouveau riche objects.
And I guess what you're talking about there are the assumptions about how images are merely illustrative, and actually what's really put into the text. So there's some sense of working within a kind of cultural, scholarly, intellectual even context that privileges the word over the image.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think one of the big questions the tablets forces us to think about is this question of illustration.
Right.
And for me, illustration is a very knotty concept for all sorts of reasons. I guess, just to talk about two, I guess one is that I think there's very little evidence actually of illustrated books in the ancient world before late antiquity. Which is to say, you do have illustrated books of technical treatises, right? You know, Artemidorus is one who you've worked with, recent discovery, if genuine, of a text alongside a series of images. Vitruvius talks about, I think there are 9 or 10 places where he tells his reader to look at a diagram. So we know that we have manuscripts, we know we have scrolls that juxtapose images and texts, but I don't think, personally, we have very much convincing evidence of a tradition of book illustration for narrative poems.
Right,
so for
that's a
like
crucial
Homer.
distinction.
That's a crucial distinction, yeah. And of course we do later on in the 5th century AD,
but the cultural context has changed by that point, where the word really is everything, the word is God.
Absolutely right, yeah, and Christianity plays their crucial role.
Yeah.
So I think there's a kind of objective objection to illustration. But for me, there's also a much larger cultural historical set of states here, which is about seeing illustration, about seeing through the lens of illustration, seeing the image as being passive, as being secondary to the text, as being illustrative to the text. And for me, at stake here is a much larger set of cultural and intellectual historical assumptions that stretch back for me ultimately to the Reformation, to Martin Luther, but also to the rationalisation of those particular ideas about what words can do and images can do in the 18th and early 19th century. So for me, illustration is fundamentally a modern concept, a concept that's rationalised, conceptualised in the 18th, 19th century, but which is very much dependent on a particular set of Lutheran Reformation assumptions about words in relation to images.
Interesting. So this subject that you've been looking at in your book really, it seems to me, opens up new vistas into thinking about our own kind of cultural framework and how we interpret.
Absolutely right. Which is very typical of these tablets. So they're tiny, they're small, you wouldn't think much of them, but they open up these much larger questions, like the Iliad in a nutshell. Right? It's tiny, right? You might not even notice the parts within the shell, but nevertheless it opens up a whole vista onto the largest and biggest of all cultural and literary spheres, namely the Iliadic epic of Homer.
I feel that we probably need a couple of examples to really unpack some of these ideas that you've been talking about.
Okay. We restrict ourselves to just 2?
Yeah. Is that possible? We don't want to, people can go and buy your book, you don't want to give everything away.
Well, maybe we should talk about the 2 most famous examples in the Capitoline museums in Rome.
Okay.
Because I guess no discussion of the Iliad tablets could bypass the so-called Tabulae Capitalina, so the Capitoline tablet. And to imagine this thing, you have to begin by imagining a sheet of A4 paper. That's how tiny this thing is. Well, it's quite big by some standards, but you have to imagine a sheet of A4 paper that's crowded with 250 figures.
Okay.
So
I'm imagining.
Yeah, summing up drastically what this thing would be like. And what we have here is a representation not just of the Iliad, but of the whole epic cycle, or rather, with some of the highlights of the epic cycle.
Okay.
And we can reconstruct the original layout of this by looking carefully at the format. If you look at the right-hand side, so as you're looking here, if you look at the right-hand side of the tablet, you'll see a series of friezes. And they're labelled from new to omega, so from book 13 to 24. And each frieze relates to one particular book of the Iliad. They're laid out spatially from top to bottom, or rather from bottom to top in this particular example. Then in the middle of the tablet, you have a depiction of the so-called fall of Troy, Iliad-Persis.
Okay.
And then underneath, you have two more poems from the epic cycle. So you have the Archaeopis, and you have the so-called Little Iliad.
Okay.
So as though the Iliad could be even smaller, you have it another poem represented.
So you've got these other poetic sources that give a bigger sense of the War of Troy.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
And you have the whole thing within something small enough to be held within your hands, or at least your outstretched hands.
And on the other side?
On the other side, the left-hand side is now lost.
Okay.
It's very clear that what you had was a series of 12 more friezes relating to the
12
first
books, yeah.
12 books. And either side, framing those sets of friezes, you also have stelae that give you, in tiny letters, give you a verbal synopsis of the whole plot of the Iliad.
So you also have text?
So you also have text.
I see.
Yeah. It's just one of the many ways in which text is integrated on the tablet. You also have, underneath slightly larger letters, an epigram, Greek epigram, that tells you to understand the techne, the art of Theodorus, the Theodorian techne, so that knowing the order of Homer, you may have the measure of every wisdom. So we have this little inscription that kind of acts as a programmatic caption for the whole thing.
Very epigrammatic, programmatic and enigmatic.
Absolutely right, yeah. I like it.
And the emphasis on order, it sounds important.
So order, or taxis in the Greek word, is a fundamental concept to how these tablets work. Because of course by visualising these tablets, laying them out in something small enough to hold in your hands, they are imposing their own sorts of orders on the scenes portrayed. And of course, in one sense, the order might look very Homeric. We can move from book 1 to 24, right, going around in a circle.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the tablets, I think, raise questions about new orders, about new sequences, about new arrangements, through the very medium of their visual language, so to speak. So the very fact that you have the same iconography used for different scenes gets you to think spatially and visually about connections that you might not have thought about through your reading.
It's iconographic patterning rather than, let's say, verbal resonances you have in the text.
Yeah, and one of the things that's been very important for recent Homeric scholarship is to think about the use of epithets and verbal formula for making you think about connections. But here those connections are all visually mediated.
Interesting. Can you give us an example?
Okay, so I'll give you one example, I guess, which pertains to the whole tablet. Right. So if you imagine the whole thing. Now it's a bit bigger than A4 because we've got the whole thing in front of us. And you have up here we have book 1, and then we have books 1 to 12 down here, and then we have 13 to 24 here. So we have the whole thing laid out before us. And of course, the strict Homeric sequence would be to go from book 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, all the way around till you get to 24. But of course, that's one thing suggested by the tablet. But at the same time, the tablet also makes us think about shortcutting the circuit.
1 to 24.
Absolutely right. So at the very top, you've got 1 to 24. Yeah, the headline. So it's as though you could go 1 to 24, skip out the rest, and then put it all back together. Right? This is one very simple way, not simple, very complex way, in which I think the spatial ordering gets us thinking about questions of the taxing Homeru intrinsic to the Homeric epic. And I guess one thing that's important to emphasise here is that the very idea of taxis, the very idea of order, or order in Latin, is something with which scholia and scholars and grammarians have debated what makes Homer very particular, very special. What's special about Homeric order, Homeric sequence, is the fact that Homer can start right in medias res, right? So start right from the beginning, take you straight into things, and yet then unpack in all sorts of proleptic or analectic ways, as modern narratologists would say, to think about the chronological relationships between the components. But of course, the tablet does something similar through its visual arrangements.
Yeah, I want to just try and unpack this 124 ring together a little bit more, because people have talked about the ring composition. The book 24 is an echo of book 1, and one very good way to think about that is think about the relationship between Achilles, Zeus and Thetis. So in book 1 you have Achilles going to his mother Thetis, she goes up to Zeus, and in book 24 that's reversed, so you get a kind of nice echo. Are there anything that you have that's structural, narratological and kind of verbal resonances going on there? Is there anything iconographic with 1 and 24 that perhaps suggests a slightly different emphasis?
Right. Well, the scene with which we end, so again I've got it in front of us, imagining through my ekphrasis, right, I've got this thing in front of us. The scene with which the first frieze of the Iliad ends is precisely that of Thetis kneeling before Zeus.
Okay,
right?
yeah.
And likewise, if you look a little bit further to the right, you'll see the scene of Priam kneeling before Achilles. So you have two scenes of supplication, one of Thetis and Zeus, and one of Priam and Achilles, that echo each other iconographically. So I think there you do actually have quite a clear example of a connection that's not necessarily there in the text, right? but which is visually mediated to get you to think about connections within the text of particular episodes and thematic subjects.
Yeah, that's interesting, particularly because you've got almost like with Thetis going to Zeus, that supplication, that's all in order to honour her son Achilles, and we seem to be being encouraged to rethink that with that scene in book 24, with the end result, if you like, is an old guy, Priam, going to Achilles.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So you have a visual echo, but also, of course, a series of very clear distinctions between the two episodes. And I think that's something that's played out. You could give all manner of examples through particular iconographic clues and repetitions. I guess one thing we could say is the significance right at the very heart of the tablet, right, the literal and metaphorical centre of this Capitoline tablet, of a scene of of Aeneas with Anchises and Ascanius. So Aeneas, the founder of Rome, right, who of course is in the Iliad but plays a kind of marginal role, but of course in the cultural network and climate that is Rome is very important. Right. So you have here, right at the centre of the tablet, this kind of single emblem, a logo, if you like, of Aeneas' centrality to this whole. That's
interesting.
Story.
The scene you've been describing with his father and son is not in here. That's from one of the other epic cycle plans.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So, there's much debated whether it's in this the relationship between this particular within the tablet between the so-called poem of the Fall of Troy, Stesichorus' lyric poem. Or what kind of role Aeneas played within the epic tradition, very much debated. But we do know that he plays a central role in the most famous Roman imperial epic of all, namely the Aeneid of Virgil. Right? And you have to imagine these people, with these Romans with the tablets in their hand, thinking about the Iliad, but actually having a very different...
Being invited to read it through a Roman lens.
Absolutely right.
With Aeneas right at the centre.
With Aeneas right at the centre, yeah. So getting, Aeneas isn't mentioned, or rather Virgil isn't mentioned in any of the inscriptions, but nevertheless here's an invitation to think about the whole Greek epic tradition through a particular Roman literary angle. And also think through a political angle too, because one of the things we know about Aeneas is that he plays this central political role for Augustus, the first Roman emperor.
Yes.
And the iconography of Aeneas with his son and his father leaving Troy with his as the ultimate act of sort of piety in the Latin term is a familiar iconographic schema repeated all over the Roman world and becomes synonymous in some sense with everything with which Augustus himself associates himself.
Interesting. So this is just like with like an iPad, basically in your hand, you're being invited to reread the entire Homeric tradition.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and maybe the iPad's a nice parallel too, because it's not just an instrument for reading, but also for playing.
Right.
So
and constructing your own patterns and meanings from those patterns.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So it's a facilitator to get you thinking anew about the epic literary tradition. So for me, there's no doubt here about the clientele for these objects. These are very erudite, very sophisticated, very culturally aware audiences that have very little to do with the kind of trimalchios.
Right, and really taking us beyond the idea of image as just illustration of the text. There's a real game being played between text and image.
So image gets you to rethink the text.
Yeah.
Image mediates new sorts of interpretations.
Yeah.
And this is something we can find throughout the Roman world and indeed the Greek. Rather than thinking about images as being secondary, as being illustrative, or being passive, they're actually very active in reshaping the sorts of stories we can tell of literature.
You've mentioned, that was one example. You mentioned there was going to be a second.
So the second example. So it's also displayed alongside it in the Capitoline Museums in Rome, in a small little cabinet in the Sala del Colombo, where very few people ever go.
You sound almost,
I'm very protective of these
things. That's
right. And it's also very small. So this time it's circular, and it's 17.8 centimetres in diameter. And so you imagine a kind of small side plate, or something like a frisbee, and you have an idea of the scale. Right? It's made from a palombino, so from a kind of pinkish stone. One friend said to me they thought it'd been in the bath too long. It's been very weathered on its surface. It was discovered in the 1880s. And was built into a late antique wall. It was very interesting later history, nevertheless it's damaged, therefore, as a surface. But you have to give it the benefit of the doubt, because the subject of this thing is remarkable. And what we see here is the so-called, inscription tells us, the so-called shield of Achilles, Theodorian, after Homer.
Well, when you were saying circular image, I was instantly thinking, that's shield. That's the shield of Achilles.
Yeah. So it's taking us back to what you mentioned earlier, the first and ultimate ekphrasis of the Greek literary tradition.
Yeah.
That crafted for Achilles, the hero, the protagonist of the poem, by Vistas, in Book 18. But what's great about this shield? I guess the first thing that's great is the size.
Yeah.
It's very small.
Yeah.
So it kind of literally makes larger-than-life heroes of those who use it. It's one of the things we know about the shields is that it's great and mighty.
Yes, and only it's for Achilles.
It's for Achilles.
It's made by the gods. Right.
Absolutely right. So it's for a larger-than-life figure. So the very act of having it in our hands, and the very fact that it's so small, makes us ourselves larger than life in some sort of way. So it's kind of nice in terms of size. But for me, it's what I would call ontological, right? I guess it's the kind of recessions of image and text that are here at stake, right? And that's a fancy way of saying that what we have here is an object that's derived from a text of an object. Right? We said before we had to lie down in dark rooms. Let me try and explain what I mean. So Homer describes an imaginary shield, right? Describes a shield, but he does so in words.
Yep.
It's the ultimate ekphrasis because it's a verbal description of something imagined, something visual. But what we have here is ekphrasis turned on its head, because we're experiencing the shield not through words, but through a material visualised form. Right? So we're moving, if you like, from shield to Homeric text to materialised object. What we have here is ekphrasis on its head, the actual object, as it were, as though Homer could here describe it. And if you look carefully at the images, you can find the whole of the Homeric ekphrasis refracted, if you like, into a series of visual forms. So at the very top, above that inscription that I mentioned before, you have two scenes. The scene of the city at peace and the city at war, taking up half of the spatial frontal side.
And these are two main scenes on the ekphrasis in the Iliad.
Absolutely right. So there are two scenes with which the ekphrasis opens.
Yeah.
Juxtaposed one alongside each other as kind of rival worlds for thinking about the Iliad itself, the world of the Iliad.
That's right, yeah.
But then after that, Homer goes on to describe a series of vignettes. So include scenes of dancing, scenes of ploughing, landscape scenes, all of these different vignettes brought together in the latter part of the epiphys. And you'll find each of those a very interesting order, actually, in spatial arrangement in the lower part of the shield. So you have the cities of peace, these vignettes underneath. And then, so far I've only talked about the inner ring of the shield, but if you look around the outer ring, you'll find some hint about the cosmic frame, because Homer starts his epiphys by laying out the sun, the moon, the sea, and the stars.
It's the whole cosmos.
It's the whole cosmos, all in one. There's a miniaturization and encapsulation of the whole world. It's what the cosmos was, or rather what the Homeric cosmos was interpreted as being. And you'll find, again, if you go to the Hellenistic world, you find all of these Hellenistic scholars saying that Homer had this cosmological understanding of the whole world was already there encased in Homer. So these allegorical readings were already there. And for its own part, the tablet gives us something similar. So you have at one end to these two vignettes, you have an image of Helios, the sun, and you have an image of Selene, the moon. And if you look around the convex space just above or round about, oblique space, you'll also find astrological symbols that refer to the 12 signs of the zodiac. So you have the whole cosmos literally encapsulated around the outer ring.
So you've got this representation of Achilles' shield, and it sounds like a reordering of it as well. How have people talked about this before?
So that's also interesting. Again, I think Anglophone scholars have been quite critical. In fact, actually, I think everyone's been quite critical of this particular piece since it was discovered, because people had a particular idea about how the Homeric shield should look.
So exactly working within that conceptual framework we've been talking about before, about wanting the image to be an illustration.
Yeah, absolutely right. Or I was thinking about, also thinking about Homer as having a very particular image in mind that he materialises. And of course, one of the things that I think is most fascinating about Homeric epiphys is that there's very little information about how the shield actually looks. Yeah, absolutely right. So
that's right.
We have these descriptions of scenes, but actually only the vaguest idea about arrangement.
Sure, and we've already talked about how scenes also seem to shift as well before our eyes.
With Philostratus and the like. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things is that people have thought about Homeric shields having a particular series of arrangements. So they've thought that the Homeric shield, one way of reconstructing it, and has been reconstructed many times, especially since the 18th century, has been to say that it's a series of concentric rings.
Right, yeah.
So you have 5 rings, one alongside, each one alongside the other. And of course that's not how the shield operates. So one way of responding to it has been to say, this poor artist hasn't quite understood what Homer
hasn't got Homer.
Absolutely right, yeah. But I think actually on the contrary he has got Homer, because Homer has only the very vaguest details of arrangement. And I think one of the things that this artist does is to get us to think about what this object might actually look like. And again, I think the artist plays very knowingly and self-consciously with what you can do with words as opposed to images. And again, for me, that takes us to what I think is the most marvellous, thaumatic, I guess, the megathauma of the shields. And we've mentioned so far the sun, the moon, the stars, but we haven't mentioned the sea, right?
The ocean.
The ocean.
Yeah, which surrounds the whole shield in Homer.
Absolutely, yeah, it surrounds the whole shield, and it also surrounds the shield description. That's to say, the ring composition of the Homeric epiphys begins with the ocean and ends with the ocean, sort of framing it, bringing it all back together. So you look at this thing, and you might think, well, where's the ocean? Then you notice around the ultimate ridge, this rim, you'll notice these very waving kind of patterns, designs. And at first, they don't seem to make any sense. They seem like scratches on the surface. But if you then look very closely, you find letters. And before we say anything about what the letters are, just say how tiny these letters are inscribed. So if you think about a fingernail, that's roughly the scale of this outer rim. So it's about a centimetre and a half, maybe 2 centimetres, just tiny. Right? Yeah. And what we have here, these letters, vary in height from between 0.7 millimetres and 1 millimetre.
Okay.
So they're literally tiny.
They're pretty small.
Very, very small. Illegible without a magnifying glass. At least for me, I sat down and I read this whole text and transcribed it. And you really do need a magnifying glass to have any chance of doing that. But what for me is interesting about the text is what's written. And what we have here is the entirety of the Homeric ekphrasis. So the full 130 lines of the Homeric text inscribed around the ultimate ultra ring of the object.
So the Achilles' shield, that's writ large in Homer, is written around this little shield.
Written around this little shield in such tiny letters that you can just about see something's there. You might just get a snippet from your looking very closely, right? But it's very difficult to read. So ekphrasis again been turned on its head because you can see it's there, but you can't read it. Normally with ekphrasis you can read it, but you can't see it. But here you can see it, but you can't read it.
And playing with text and image again.
Absolutely right. So we've said, haven't we, that what we have on the shield is a movement from the shield as an imaginary object to the Homeric text to the material object. But here we go one further.
You've even got the Homeric text.
So we go from object, text, and this recession or replication of ontological levels between what you can see and what you can read, all brought together in this amazing feat, this megafauna of miniature writing.
And what's more, I mean, what you described me before, and what I thought you were going to say initially, but I guess it's true, that you see these squiggly lines, so it actually looks like the sea as well.
Actually looks like the sea, absolutely right. So they kind of also function as kind of waves. And one of the things that's interesting there is thinking about how you figure the sea. Because in the ancient world, Homer, as you well know, is the ultimate ocean. It's the best metaphor for thinking about this. It's the source from and to which everything flows. Homer is the ocean. So here we have the ocean figured around the rim of this object, but through the very medium of Homer.
Homer's being literalised.
Homer's being literalised. So these grammata can be understood at once as kind of wavy patterns that work visually, but also work literally as letters. And of course that pun between image and text is already there in the ancient Greek. We have different words here to describe a letter from a picture, but in the ancient Greek both are grammar. Grammata means both. It literally means strokes. It refers to the strokes of a letter or to those of a picture. Likewise, grapheme, the Greek verb, means both to write and to draw, something fundamental to Philostratus and to Imagines, as we mentioned before. But these are grammata that work at once visually and literally. And the object, as ever, plays with this ambiguity, this ambivalence between what you can see and what you can read. So for me, that particular tablet, and you can see it, 17.8 centimetres of it.
And this is in Capitoline Museum in Rome.
Yeah, for me, that encapsulates, in a nutshell, as it were, the encapsulating gaze of the Iliac tablets at large.
You said that discussing this stuff, you're going to need to lie down. I think I'm going to need to lie. That sounds really fascinating.
Lie down and maybe another beer.
Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure. You've done such a great job of playing your games, really, of describing what these visual objects with words. And if you want to read more, we'll have a link on the website.
We'll put some pictures up on the website too, so you
Fantastic.
don't have to rely on my ekphrasis.
And we'll have a link to your book, and I really encourage people to read it. And it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing us these games of text and image with us.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.